is actually kind of, this is what you all are here for, not necessarily our coalition background, but still wanted to provide that for you all. I will provide more information on that in a couple slides, but so next up, there, as many of us have heard, there's 7.5 billion that's towards electric vehicle charging network. This actually is kind of broken out in a couple different ways. So the first bit here, 5 billion goes towards a national EV charging network. And it's through formula funds that are distributed to each state. This is now called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, so NEVI. And this is what I'm going to cover in great detail today. But then I also just wanted to mention the other programs as well. So the other 2.5 billion are for community grants. And this isn't specific to EV charging. It can also be used for hydrogen, natural gas, and propane fueling infrastructure. Propane, for whatever reason, is only, that infrastructure has to be for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And then to further break that out, 1.25 billion of the funding will be for fueling along designated corridors, but this is a grant program, not a formula. It's separate from what I'm going to be talking about a little mostly today. And these, as it's a grant program, this can be, you can apply for this as a community. I think there's going to be a lot more information actually, because it must be established by November. So I'm not going to try to say some things that I'm not entirely certain of. But then the next piece is 1.25 billion funding for communities. So this is also infrastructure that can go within a community that might be filling a gap along that isn't necessarily meeting the corridor needs, but is still a great place for alternative fuel infrastructure. And we'll know more about these programs in the future. In additional other programs, there will be, there's 5.6 billion in support of the low and no emission transit bus deployments. So this program, I believe it started in 2016, and I think the first round of funding only had $50 million. So you can see, and even last year, I think there was $120 million that went towards the program. And so so this is just a huge uptick in funding, and the program in the past has been highly competitive, but I believe it's still going to be very competitive because there's a lot more awareness around the program and a lot more interest in this type of bus deployment. But this is funding that START here in Jackson has received. That's how they were able to fund 8 of their of the Proterra buses that we have, as well as I believe they have funding for 4 additional electric buses. And then Mountain Line in Missoula has also received some of these funds. So this I don't have great detail on at the moment, but we just to be aware that there's significantly more funding for transit bus deployments that are low and no emission. And then also there's 5 billion that's set aside for the electric school bus deployments, 2.5 billion for electric school buses, and 2.5 billion for clean school buses, which could be propane, natural gas. So today, though, we are mostly focused on the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation and this NEVI program, because the guidelines were just released on February 10th. So I'm going to go into detail about both of these. So the Joint Energy and Transportation Office, it was established because there's a lot of overlap between the Department of Energy and Transportation. And this is actually a pretty unique situation. A lot of times these federal agencies don't really overlap with their communications or their programming. So this is really unique and is going to, I think, just make these programs that are funded through the infrastructure bill even stronger. So they have 9 areas of emphasis, and they launched this beautiful website on February 8th. It's driveelectric.gov. Go check it out. They have a lot of great resources that we'll be going through today as well. Okay, so the NEVI formula program, the guidance was released on February 10th, and that was required in the bill. I think it was, I forget how many days, but there was a specific amount of days that they had to develop this guidance. But it provides the the guidance to deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And it's really meant to establish an interconnected network across the country. It's a national electric. We need to think of this as a national infrastructure. And some of the dates to be aware of. So we're on February 10th, the program guidance was released. And then also the alternative fuel corridor round for new nominations also opened on February 10th. I will go into this in a bit more detail, but this is really closely linked to the NEVI program because the funding through the NEVI program currently is earmarked for sites that are along these designated corridors. So the Federal Highway Administration has already had previously 5 rounds of nominations. So state agencies, I believe even some local agencies were able to nominate corridors in their states that either had adequate alternative fuel infrastructure that they believed could meet the requirements or the criteria laid out in this program, or they had plans in place. So with this program, there's kind of 2 sets, and this will make more sense when I show a map in a minute, but you could either nominate a corridor. So these corridors are interstates or your US highways, and they could be corridor ready, where for EVs, you needed to have infrastructure every 50 miles. And each fuel had very specific requirements, or pending. And a lot of our states have corridors that are nominated and designated as pending. So that means that the state has plans in place to install the proper infrastructure to allow vehicles to travel throughout the state and meet the requirements of this program. So this NEVI program is great because it is, for the longest time, we've been talking about this alternative fuel corridor program, and there hasn't been funding associated with it. And finally, this NEVI program is that funding to help really fill in these corridors. May 13th is the next date to be aware of. There is going to be even further information or standards and requirements that will better inform potential site hosts and station hosts for these funds. And then this is also when round 6 nominations are due. So because the NEVI funds can only be used on alternative fuel corridors that are nominated, there is going to be this last kind of round where states can look at their current map and see if they want to nominate any additional routes in the state. And this will make sense in a minute, but each state is to develop a plan on how they're going to use these funds, and that's due August 1st. And then September 30th, the Federal Highway approves these plans, and then the states can start spending. Okay, so this program it is a 5-year program. Each year, $1 billion is appropriated. So in fiscal year 2022, we have $1 billion appropriated. The Joint Office is receiving, just for this year, $300 million to help establish this new office. And then 10% of the funds are also going to be set aside to assist states and governments that need additional assistance. And then the Federal Highway Administration gets $15 million for operation administration. So this leaves $615 million for this fiscal year to be dispersed among the states. So you'll see here the states that we operate within over the total 5-year funding. This is about the levels that each state will receive. And then just for this next year, in fiscal year 2022, Idaho gets almost $4.5 million, Montana a little over $6 million, and then Wyoming almost $4 million. So what can be funded with these with this money? This is a significant amount of money. It's very exciting to go towards putting infrastructure all throughout our state. So any EV charging infrastructure, it has to be located, I've said this a few times now, along a designated alternative fuel corridor. This is the EV ready or pending that you can see here that I had mentioned. And then again, states can consider nominating additional corridors if they feel that's necessary. For a corridor to be fully built out, and that the secretary to certify that the state's designated alternative fuel corridor criteria is met, EV charging infrastructure is installed every 50 miles, and it has to be within 1 mile of the interstate. This is different from previous criteria. I think it was up to 5 miles, maybe 3 or 5 miles, but now it's within 1 mile of the interstate. EV charging infrastructure includes at least 450 kilowatt DC fast charging chargers with the CCS port. This is also new. I mean, this whole thing is new, but different than what the previous 5 rounds kind of had required of nominations, because there also needed to be a CHAdeMO port, but now they're only looking to have CCS enabled. So I don't know if that makes that easier or less expensive. We'll find out. But this is each of the sites along the corridor have to have 4 DC fast charging stations. So a quad. And then EV charging infrastructure has a minimum station power capability at or above 600 kW. And it looks like then additional considerations deemed as necessary by the Secretary of Transportation. That's kind of like the gist of what could be funded. So I wanted to just take a peek at all of the states, just so you can understand where these stations can be located, could be located. The state agencies are going to come up with a very specific plan for the state, but this is kind of just a very high level general overview. So you'll see in Montana currently, these are the corridors that are designated EV pending. And so there's about over 2,000 miles of corridors. So if the station site needs to be located every 50 miles, that's about 43 different sites that Montana is looking at needing to install to fill it out. Idaho also has about a little over 1,000 miles of designated alternative fuel corridors. And you can see here on Idaho that there's actually the green line is it's ready. So that means that section of the interstate has met the criteria of the program, and the dotted lines are where it's still pending. So Idaho needs about 25 stations, or sites, not stations, sites with 4 stations. And then Wyoming currently has I-90, I-80, and I-25 designated. And this, just this amount here would require 18 stations to fully fill out. But as we've mentioned, or as I've mentioned in the criteria, you can nominate additional corridors. And we know a lot of folks travel to Wyoming and through a region specifically to go to the national parks. So this map I just pulled from an EV study that was produced for the Department of Transportation. You can see here there's several other secondary and like an MPS route. So there is the potential that perhaps like a couple other routes could be nominated within the state of Wyoming to fully fill out the state, if the state agencies find that interesting to do. I think it would make sense, considering that whole portion of their state right now is kind of wide open. All right, this is a lot of information, but a lot of numbers, but I really wanted to just show what this funding could do in the first year, basically. So I pulled some of the costs for the chargers from the EV study that was produced for the state of Wyoming. These are averages. Until some of these are in the ground, we won't really know the total numbers. Utility, so let's see, ballpark for 4 DC fast charging stations, around $400,000. Utility upgrades, $100,000. I think this could be significantly less if you are very strategic with where you're locating your stations. If it's in areas that the utility already has great infrastructure, but there's many remote rural areas in all of our states that, you know, we're going to need significant utility upgrades or potentially off-grid options such as, you know, solar or all sorts of different, there could be a lot of fun things that are developed to make sure that these are powered. Installation, that could also vary. So we're looking at this is just averages, but total cost $630,000. The federal share is 80% and the match is 20%. So with that, if we're looking at the total number of, with these numbers, you could see here that the total number of sites that could be funded with fiscal year 2022 funding is almost 9 for Idaho, about 12 for Montana, and 8 for Wyoming. So I just wanted to throw this out here for everybody to take a peek at to see, you know, this is a lot for a potential station site host to consider. And this is also, but it's also very encouraging for potential EV owners to know as well, that in the next 5 years, this is the amount of infrastructure that will be deployed. And in the next really year, this is what we're going to be seeing throughout our state. So if that's, you know, helpful to know in your next vehicle purchasing decision, I think that is helpful to know for your next vehicle purchasing decision. So, and I'll be updating this information as we get more accurate numbers or real-time numbers, but right now this is just some averages in there for us to just take a peek at for ballpark numbers. And then I'm going to not cover this greatly because this is what we're going to hear from Neil and Kyla and Jesse about, but each state under this NEVI program is required to develop a plan and submit it, as the timeline said, by August 1st. And it can be submitted prior to that as well. And these infrastructure plans have to include various different sections. I have them bullet pointed here, but I just put public engagement bold because I feel like that is something our stakeholders you all could be interested in being involved in. And that's something that Yellowstone-Teton Clean Cities will be trying to communicate with everyone so that you're aware of when you can engage. And today feels like one of those moments. Equity is definitely a big aspect of these plans. There is a new program that's it's called Justice 40, and there's guidance that was issued by the White House, and at least it targets at least 40% of the benefits towards disadvantaged communities, and rural and underserved are considered disadvantaged communities. I think we'll be getting more information and trainings about this aspect of the plan. And this is the funds the money can fund various different aspects of installing a station. So it's, of course, the acquisition or installation, but it also can help fund the operating or it can help fund operating assistance, development phase activities, signage, data sharing, traffic control devices, and mapping and analysis activities. I think these are going to be even more clear with that May date that I had mentioned earlier. And then I will skip through this. So here's I'll share these slides when I can. And as I mentioned, we are recording this. So this is just some contact information, but you can easily find all of this on just the driveelectric.gov website, which is great. And I'm going to end my part here, and I will pass this off now to Montana. So we'll hear from Neil and Kyla about what's going on there. And I think we'll just do questions at the end because I feel Neil, Kyla, and Jesse might answer some of your questions as we go along. All right. Well, thank you, guys.
Thanks, Alicia. I'm still trying to figure out where the screen is for me to share the presentation, although you were able to share a lot of the information that we're hoping to do. So while I look for that, again, my name is Neil. I'm an energy resource professional at the Energy Office at the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Can you see my screen? You're muted, Alicia.
That looks good.
Yes.
Yes,
Great.
we can see it.
Yeah, we can see you.
Thank you, everyone. Kyla, do you want to?
What's that?
Do you want to introduce yourself too?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. This is Kyla Mackey. I work with Neil, also in the Energy Office at the Department of Environmental Quality in Montana.
So usually for presentations like this, we like to keep it simple just so that we're not confusing folks with a lot of complicated government speak. But I think it's important, as Alicia already did, to let people know some of the terminologies that are being thrown around so that people can be aware of what they are when they hear more information from their state agencies and stakeholder partners as this funding continues to roll out. So NEVI, you're probably going to hear a lot of over the next year, 5 years, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. So as Alicia talked about, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a lot of different funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And the one that's being talked about right now is the formula program, that those pots of money that Alicia highlighted that are coming automatically to the states. And so in the guidance, I've provided links at the bottom of some of these slides for folks to look up. driveelectric.gov is the main website that folks should be looking up, not only to see information about what the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which is a joint venture between the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Transportation, are working on, but you can also find the guidance that was issued on February 10th. It was the 90-day guidance, so it was the first round of guidance that gave us more details, in particular things like 4 charging stations with a minimum of 150 kilowatt capacity at each charging location, and a lot of other things. So you can go into a lot more detail there. If you look at the timeline, where we're at right now is just after that February 10th box in the top of the middle of this slide. So they've done that. There's going to be another round of guidance released May 13th. And then after that, these these EV infrastructure deployment plans are due before or by August 1st. And then the Federal Highway Administration is required to approve those plans before September 30th. And those plans have to be approved before the states can actually start spending the money. And so again, if approved, the states can start spending those formula dollars. So the Energy Office at Montana DEQ is going to be playing a significant role in developing the Montana plan. And of course, with these funds, the way that they're structured by Congress, they're transportation related funds. So they have already flowed to the state DOTs. So they are already with the Montana Department of Transportation. We'll definitely be collaborating with them to get stakeholder and public input from Montanans on how we should be structuring this plan and how these funds should be allocated across the state. Alicia showed a map. I thought I'd show my slightly fancier one that we have for the corridors that have already been designated. We did this again in partnership with MDT, the entire lengths of these 5 highway corridors. So right now, other states, including Montana, have designated these, and this is where the formula funding can be spent. There are other pots of money that have not yet been issued guidance on that are competitive grant programs that will be through the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. They can be spent in other parts of the state that aren't along designated corridors. So for Montanans, familiar with the state, in the center of the Montana is Lewistown, pretty significant transportation hub, pretty significant town in terms of population. They're not along a corridor right now, but there will be funding opportunity available in the future through competitive grants and other opportunities to fund charging station locations in places like Lewistown and other non-corridor. But for the purposes of the formula funding, which is what we're moving on with first, that's the corridors here in Montana. And those cities that are marked are just for reference points. There's going to be a whole host of cities and towns and communities where we're going to be identifying charging locations. So again, as Alicia mentioned, each of these locations need to have 150 kilowatt capacity to a single vehicle with a CCS plug. And there has to be at least 4 of those chargers at each location that can charge 4 electric vehicles simultaneously. So if any of you have ever seen Electrify America charging location, that usually has at least 4 chargers, or Tesla superchargers that usually have anywhere between 4 and, I don't know, a lot, 8 or 12 sometimes charger stations at a single location. You have to be able to have 4 cars there at least all at the same time, being able to get at least 150 kilowatts of juice flowing into the vehicle's battery. They need to be publicly available. They need to be spaced no more than 50 miles apart. Off of each of those corridors, they need to be within 1 travel mile. The corridor amenity thing is actually something I forgot to take off from a previous funding opportunity, but they need to be at least a mile off. So when you get off the exit of an interstate, no more than a mile supposedly for where that charging location will be. We're going to get more guidance from the feds on the operation standards, but one of the things they did announce on February 10th is that they need to achieve a high level of reliability. And they said in there that these stations need to be operational 97% of the time or more. So if you're traveling from one side of the state to the other, you need to have, with almost absolute certainty, knowledge or comfort that charging station will be operational. So that'll be an important thing to do. Again, with these plans that Alicia showed some points on, and you can also read more about in the guidance, the Federal Highway Administration, the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation, have made it very clear that all states that want to use this money need to get significant and meaningful public input and do outreach to key stakeholders in order to find out what makes sense for each state's transportation plan. And so the Energy Office at Montana DEQ will be doing that over the next few months in partnership with MDT. And we hope to make some more announcements soon about the timing and the way that we're going to be doing that. But in the meantime, people should definitely read up on the guidance that was issued on February 10th to learn more about what we already know. There's a lot in there that we don't know that will be announced come May 13th. But we would be definitely interested to hear what folks have to say once you've had a chance to look at that guidance.
And I can just add a little bit on to what Neil said as far as Montana's plans at this point. A lot of this is preliminary, but one of the key pieces of the EV infrastructure deployment plan that needs to be submitted before we can spend the formula funds is kind of an idea, states providing an idea of where they're going to put these stations along the corridors. Neil mentioned the corridors that we've designated here in Montana as EV corridor pending. So we have actually been working with a consultant on some prioritization analysis for locations along each of those corridors. That's still in the works, but essentially what we're trying to get out of that analysis is identifying key locations and prioritizing those based on important factors for travel in Montana. And so that study is looking at an electric vehicle market analysis, for the state in 2030 as well as 2040. So looking ahead of how many EVs will be driving in the state. An important component of that analysis is also factoring in projected out of state electric vehicle drivers, since tourism is a really important part of Montana's economy, and more people are visiting Montana in an electric vehicle. What is the projected additional electric vehicle traffic looking out 10 years? And so how many of the 12 million visitors that Montana has each year, how many of those are going to be driving in an EV? And then also the study is looking at sort of the energy impact analysis of the additional electric vehicles that are driving in the state. So getting at some of those concerns around additional energy needs for EVs and potential grid impacts. And then it also, the bulk of the study is looking at some location analysis. So looking at those 50-mile gaps along each of the corridors, how many locations do we need and where should those be located? And then finally, helping us with some prioritization, looking at traffic counts along each of those highways and interstates that have been designated, the available amenities, whether a location might be a connection hub. So at the cross section between key interstates and highways in the state. Also some overlaying to get at some of that Justice 40 vulnerability considerations, overlaying some vulnerability data, demographic data on impacts of emissions at various locations across the state. So that study we're expecting to be done at the end of March, early April, and that will be a key piece of our EV deployment plan. But of course, the state's plan, the public input's going to be the most important component of that as we reach out to stakeholders and have opportunities. So more to come on that, but quite a bit to do in the next 6 months before we file those plans.
Thank you, both of you, for providing that update with Montana. And then I think, yeah, we look forward to engaging on this process. And then I will pass it over to Jesse. And then once Jesse's done, then we'll do questions from everyone.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks, Alicia. Just real quickly, I think we're coming to the end here. I think we've covered the program pretty well. Just give you an update on where we are in Wyoming. We actually established an interstate working group back in June to develop a strategy. We were lucky enough to have a draft strategy ready when this guidance dropped. We were also lucky enough to make a bunch of assumptions that aligned with the policy guidance. We briefed the draft strategy to the governor's chief of staff last week or the week before. Got a thumbs up. In the next couple of weeks, we have an hour set up with the governor. If he approves the draft strategy, we will then circulate it for public comment in April. We've got a number of public sessions that we're arranging to host, both in-person and virtual meetings to publish the strategy. Thankfully, the strategy addresses almost all the requirements in the EV plan put out in the NEVI guidance. There's a couple of the paragraphs that we didn't address because really aren't pertinent to Wyoming, but the items that we're short, we'll make sure that we're in there. And then from there, once we get feedback from public review, we'll make a final decision. And then once that strategy is approved, we'll publish it for everyone to review. And it will describe how we're going to implement the NEVI guidance and how we're going to use the incentive funds that we have in the state. To address a couple of the specifics Alicia pointed to when she talked about Wyoming. The first one is the alternative fuel corridors. At this time, I don't think we plan on nominating more, and that's for a couple of very simple reasons. The first is once your alternative fuel corridors are built out, then we can divert funds to off corridor stations. And so what we don't want to do is have to build 50 stations every 50 miles, right? So if we we nominate additional alternative fuel corridors, and we're held to the 50-mile between stations, that stresses even more our ability to kind of spread the money around the state. And so at this point, what we're planning on doing is once we get the alternative fuel corridors built out, we will build routes and corridors, but we won't ask that they be designated, so we're not held to that 50-mile rule. So what you'll get is kind of the same impact, but we also recognize, and I'm just going to use an example on one of our current corridors. It's about 79 miles between Rawlins and Rock Springs. I think it is, might be between Laramie and Rock Springs. And there's nothing between those two towns but antelope and vultures. And it's really difficult for us to provide any capability for anyone to have a return on investment by putting a station between those two towns. It's even difficult now for a station to basically pay its way by putting stations in the towns themselves based upon our current vehicle density. So it'll be even more difficult for someone to be capable of operating a station profitably or even covering costs in a town. It's almost impossible somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, probably without the supportive broadband or electrical infrastructure necessary. And if you've read the NEVI guidance, that's the example that they use to ask for relief from that 50-mile requirement. So I've already identified those points on our state, and I've already reached out to the Joint Task Force and asked for the procedure to request these exemptions. And they came back and said, well, we're not ready to tell you what that procedure is yet. So to basically prevent that from happening in other areas of the state, we probably will not designate corridors, but we will build appropriate corridors out. And I think that also allows us the ability to then divert any additional leftover funds to some off corridor locations and make sure that we can cover the state as quickly as possible. I think that's all I got, unless there's any specific questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. That's an interesting observation or strategy about the not designating additional corridors. I know there's a few states that were a little overzealous in their designations of corridors, and they would like to de-designate some so they can actually fill out those corridors, but that's not an option. So I guess it's
having the freedom to use that money elsewhere after the corridors are built out really kind of eliminates any advantage to designating something, in our case anyway, because there's so long a distance with nothing between here and there. There's no advantage to us to do it right now as long as we can use those funds anyways.
Mm-hmm. Well, since we were talking about, I guess I'll take the first question then for Kyla and Neil. Do you all have any intentions of designating additional corridors? I know Montana's pretty well covered already, but just since we were discussing that with Wyoming.
I can take this. We're still kind of deciding that, but we had the same conversation, almost identical to what Jesse was just talking about. There's going to be some real challenging areas and locations along our current corridors, particularly Highway 2. As you noted, it's 666 miles, and getting that built out is going to be a challenge. So I think we've got our work cut out for us with our current corridors, and that sort of, I guess, off ramp of saying you can use the funds outside of corridors once you've built the existing ones out is, makes it not so attractive. So, yeah, at this point, we're still making a final decision on that, and we'll talk with our Department of Transportation, but we're in the same boat as the other rural states. So,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Alicia, just quickly, since I got Montana on here, I actually had a conversation today with Yellowstone and the Park Service to synchronize, because, our stuff takes us to Jackson. Our plan kind of gets us to Jackson. But then it stops. You still got to get from Jackson to the park. And they're just starting to figure this out also, and whether they're going to put public stations in the parks, and they don't really have an answer. Have you guys reached out to the Park Service yet to talk about access from the Montana side at all?
Yeah, well, Lynn in Yellowstone, I've been in communication with her mostly lately on infrastructure for their internal fleet, but that's kind of the first step for them. So yeah, but actually I think David's with Grand Teton National Park. You might have a little bit more information if with your conversations with Yellowstone, if you wanted to pipe in. I don't know if there's anyone else from Yellowstone on the call that I'm noticing.
Yeah, Alicia, we're in a similar boat as Yellowstone in that we're really focused on our electrifying our internal fleet right now, and not so much on public, although we are very aware that the public is coming with their electric vehicles. And so that's sort of our next step. We do have one concessionaire that has charging infrastructure in place at Signal Mountain Lodge right now. And we hope that some others will come online. But, Jesse, we don't have sort of a full strategic plan, linking up to Yellowstone and then, out beyond the parks. It's on our radar, but, at this point, we're still trying to feel our way through, this process as well.
And there's a grant that we're a part of called West Smart EV, and I know there's some folks that are doing some modeling on travel patterns and potential, like I think kind of what Kyla was saying, that the study will show for Montana, as well as like an understanding of the amount of EVs that will be coming, and kind of strategizing the locations and amount of infrastructure needed to support that. So I think that study will be out this spring. So hopefully this will help inform some of the national parks in our region here.
I would just add on that we haven't been directly in touch with the park yet, but to the question about, the Montana side of Yellowstone, in a previous funding opportunity using our Volkswagen settlement dollars, we did identify Gardner and West Yellowstone as priority locations for key tourist destinations. There's a charging station that's been installed, isn't fully online yet, though, just outside of Gardner, so at the northern entrance of Yellowstone. And we're still working to see if we can get the West Yellowstone project up and moving. So from the Montana side of the park, we do hope to have fast chargers, not the capacity that the bipartisan infrastructure law is requiring, but that doesn't really matter because those locations are not on designated corridors right now. So we do want to make sure that we're driving people. And one of the ultimate goals, looking at the map that both Alicia and I shared earlier, is to have a park-to-park corridor from Glacier to Yellowstone. And so whether you're going up I-15 or Highway 93, we're hoping over the next few years to be able to build out that corridor so people can get to the camping or outdoor recreation places they want to go.
Thank you, Neil. I'm glad that you brought that up about Gardner.
On that point about Gardner and the capacity of charger stations that they have there, in Montana, we currently have 7 fast charging locations spread across the state. 3 of those are Electrify America stations, and others are funded by our Volkswagen settlement dollars, and some are private investments by companies. Except for the Electrify America ones, none of them are at that 150 kilowatt capacity rate that the federal funding is requiring. And so we've been asked, what happens if there's for example, there's a fast charger that we helped fund at the Audi Bozeman dealership, just off of the Main Street exit in Bozeman, Montana. It's a 50 kilowatt capacity charger, so it's a third of the capacity that the federal funding would require. Would we have to, fund another fast charging location in Bozeman in order to, get to the federal requirements to have an EV corridor ready? Or other people have asked, could you just build on those existing locations? So could you add higher 150 kilowatt capacity chargers or more at that Audi Bozeman dealership, and consider then Bozeman is there for part of the federal requirements? We're still looking for guidance on that. As Jesse said, we have Montana, just like Wyoming and a lot of other states, have questions to the joint office. In the February 10th guidance, they did say that they want to be flexible. So, in terms of designating these corridors as ready instead of just pending, we're hoping that there will be a certain amount of flexibility, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered by the feds. So we're hoping to hear more on that over the next couple of months.
In the briefing that was provided to Clean Cities, they said that the corridors that are designated ready with the past guidelines, they won't be downgraded. So to me, it feels like if that's the case, those stations that were also installed in accordance with your plan to get towards EV ready, those should count. But I'm not the feds. So, but I feel like if they're gonna accept that for those pending, they should also for ready, they should accept it as you're building towards ready. But we'll find out when they provide more guidance. Neil, did you say you had another question that you're going to answer?
That was it.
Okay. And let's see, do we have any other questions in the chat? Let's see, Molly, does any of this address heavy vehicles, alternative fuel for deliveries? I believe this is all geared mostly towards light duty kind of travel, but there could be, I believe these vehicles could use them. It's not the sole focus, but perhaps.
So I can take a swing at it, and then Kyla can correct me. So with this formula funding, again, that technical jargon, Molly, that we mentioned earlier, NEVI formula funding. So this NEVI formula funding is only for electric vehicle charging stations. I believe that some medium duty vehicles could use these charging stations, like an electric powered school bus or things of that nature. But in terms of the large heavy duty semis, like the Tesla's been working on forever, and Volvo I think has as well, Nikola, those are significantly larger batteries, and I don't think they'd be able to use those. But there is, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, a discretionary grant program that I alluded to earlier that also has propane, compressed natural gas, I think liquefied natural gas, as eligible fuels that entities could apply for and build out along highways and corridors. So, but that's something that I wouldn't expect to hear any guidance on, I don't think, until this fall, is what I heard. So for now, in terms of gasoline or diesel fueling infrastructure, so electric or other alternate fuels, this NEVI formula program for electric vehicle charging stations is what is primarily going to be talked about. And later this year, we'll hear more from the feds on the other fuels.
Hey, Alicia, this is Jesse. I think the NEVI funding, the way it's worded is it's got to be public facing and or support 2 or more commercial carriers, which suggests to me that if you have 2 commercial companies with large enough EV fleets, that they could have access to this funding.
Okay. Great. That's helpful. Let's see, Arn, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Alicia. Arn Jorgensen, Town of Jackson Vice Mayor. And it's as much of a comment as a question. Thank you all for doing this. I really appreciate the discussion and the focus, and really encourage and looking forward to the town taking part in some of these requests. I just wanted to encourage, and each of you have touched on it actually in different ways, the notion of our tourist destinations. You specifically were talking about Yellowstone, Grand Teton. For Wyoming, I would add in Devil's Tower. Places that want to make sure we're thinking about them not just as a corridor, but as a destination. So you may get a number of people that are in Yellowstone for a week, as opposed to traveling through. And I think it's a really important element. And Jesse, I had not thought about your idea of the corridors and focusing on that. The Rollins to Rock Springs segment is a great example of the challenges that we face in these states. So I really appreciate that nuance that I was not aware of, but I really would encourage, the Park Service, Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Devil's Tower, Glacier, to really be working carefully with you at the statewide level, or vice versa, since I'm talking to the state, to find solutions there. Because right now, at least in the Jackson area, as a gateway community, what's happening in the parks is significantly lagging what we've been able to do in Jackson. I'm glad to see that Cody's starting to talk about it as well. So I just want to make that statement. There's really not a question better than that, but thank you, Alicia.
Yeah, I'd like to actually respond to that, because Arnie's highlighted one of the struggles we've had when we've developed our strategy and how we communicate it. And you kind of hit the nail on the head when I talked to the director about this. And that's this notion of at least this initial formula funds has to be used first on the corridor, right? I mean, that is a program descriptor, and it's not that we don't want to think about that. In fact, we're trying to pull all the levers we can, because we have VW settlement money. And I think Alicia did a great job of highlighting at least 3 other grant programs that are, one's through the Federal Transit Authority for buses, for community busing. And then there's a couple other ones, a community grant program, and then kind of a direct to consumer program that you can use off corridor. And we got to make sure we communicate those opportunities to folks. But you are getting to one of these struggles we have, is clearly communicating that this first tranche of money's got to be used on the corridors. It's not that we would want to do our own program if we could, but we can't. And that's where I'll need your help in recognizing, at least initially, until we can get the corridors built out, they have to be used there first. So there's a sense of urgency to get them done as quickly as we can. Think about it. $5 billion is going to be dumped into a very small group of manufacturers and contractors capable of installing this stuff in a very short amount of time, and Buy America requirements apply. That amount of money being focused in a very small subgrouping of people who make these things, and practically none of that stuff is made in the US, that's a huge challenge. And I think we're going to be waiting a long time. I know the money's got to be allocated in 5 years, but I think we're all going to be waiting a very long time for a lot of this stuff to be built out, because there's just not going to be enough people to install it and enough of these machines to put them in the ground.
Okay, this is Paul Jensen here from Greenways to Go. And since the requirement is 50 miles between stations, and we are in states where there's quite a long distance between places where you can put the chargers in, does the bill include anything for battery storage and solar arrays in order to support the charging stations? Simply because in some areas the frequency of charging initially will be relatively low and can be handled by battery storage, and utilities may not have adequate medium voltage supply for the locations. Does anybody know how the bill addresses solar panels and battery storage together with EV charging?
This is Jesse again. I personally I believe the bill provides the flexibility to utilize technology if the existing utility technology does not support 600 kilowatts of power push at once, which again, not written for a place like Wyoming. You know, they want all four at 150 and all four being used at the same time. And I don't foresee that in our state for a decade, unless the Ford Lightning really takes off and everyone in Wyoming wants to buy a Ford Lightning, but a Ford can't build them that fast.
Yeah.
The problem in Wyoming, and I expect in some of these other states, is our own internal state regulation with utilities and what utilities can do with demand charging and what can happen in a utilities area is going to be more restrictive than the actual technology used to provide the power at the station. And so that, I think, for me right now is a bigger challenge than finding someone capable of building me a container to pop in the middle of nowhere, you know, that uses solar, uses a fuel cell, uses a generator, uses battery backup, and can supply 600 kilowatts of power all at the same time. That's less of a challenge than the current state regulations with basically what a utility gets to do in their service area.
Okay. Yeah.
If that makes sense. And
Sure
that's,
does.
I'm not saying that applies anywhere, but that applies in Wyoming. That's a bigger challenge.
Good. Thank you.
And then we're at time right now, but Patrick has had his hand up, so we'll go ahead and have this one last question, and then we'll sign off. But thank you all for being here. And if you need to take off, we understand. So go ahead, Patrick.
Oh, hi, thanks. I was just curious, with the Tesla superchargers, they announced that they're going to be adding the CCS compatibility. If they do that, would that eliminate being able to put other chargers on the corridor in the same areas that they already have the supercharger stations?
That's a good question. I think so. If these Tesla locations get flipped to having that CCS compatibility, that would fulfill the requirements of the FHWA alternative fuel corridor criteria. So those then could be included as like that site and location is covered.
I think if they meet the other technical requirements of 4 150 kilowatt stations and within a mile of the interstate. Right, because you got those other requirements. I don't know that Tesla has 600 kilowatt chargers and that they're within a mile of the interstate.
Mhm.
Well,
Tesla doesn't own service stations like that tend to be along the interstates.
I respectively have to disagree. They're almost all of them are along the interstates.
I'm just asking. I don't know if they are. They would. That's all. The only thing I can think of. I would assume they can, as long as they meet the other technical requirements of at least four 150 kilowatt ports, all capable of operating simultaneously and within a mile. If they are, I don't see why they wouldn't. Right? It doesn't require a specific brand of it. It just has to be public facing. Right now, they're not public facing. They're Tesla. They're private. So if they
for our purposes, we're assuming they're not public facing. And I mean, that could change in 5 years. They've done a couple pilot kind of projects, or Tesla's working with a couple European countries on that, but it seems very, very early. And so with the timeline of this funding, it doesn't seem likely, but if that changes, then we would incorporate those stations, Tesla stations that meet the requirements.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. Good thought. And then Neil added here for the eligibility of storage or renewable energy generation on page 12 of the guidance, they have information and they would be considered as eligible. So, and then somebody did ask here about when the funding will be available, if it's September. And that was actually a question that I had, because it shows that, the latest that the plans can be submitted is August 1st, and then then they have to, provide their feedback by the end of September. But what if you do get your plan in by June? Could you then have funds in July? I don't know that the answer to that. Does anyone at the state know that answer?
I think it depends on when the FHWA approves the state plans. So you could submit it in June, but then you could spend the next 2 or 3 months going back and forth with them on details. So it depends on when that plan gets approved, and then you then end up having to also develop the request for applications itself, and making sure that the state understands, internally, us at DEQ, the folks over that we work with at MDT that have the money right now, how all that is going to move forward in a seamless way so that the public can get their applications in. So I've been saying generally fall-ish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Joshua also just asked, if I purchase stations now in the next couple of months, would the government do a reimbursement if eligible?
No.
Not in Montana. We can't expend funds, or we can't use funds to pay for expenses that were incurred prior to signing of contracts. So.
Idaho, Wyoming.
That makes sense. All right. Well, we've gone over a little bit, but thank you all for taking the time to be here. Thank you so much, Neil, Kyla, Jesse, for being here and answering the questions from the state perspective. And then we also had a couple of folks on the chat mention the companies that they represent. So take a peek there if you're looking for different manufacturers. I said that weird. But we'll be in communication, and when any of our states have avenues for public engagement, we'll be sharing that with everyone so that we can all provide our input to make sure that everyone's eligible and the FHWA approves the plans really quickly. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Did any of the speakers have a final thought that you want to leave with everyone? All right, great. Well, we'll share these slides in the presentation, and look forward to working with folks to help develop some projects in the future here. So thank you guys.